Hello and welcome to interest.co.nz. I'm Gareth Vaughan with another of our double shot interviews, and I'm here with Richard Yetsenga, who's the ANZ Group Chief Economist. Hi Richard, and welcome to Auckland and New Zealand and interest.co.nz. Look, we'll kick off by asking you about your expectations for the global economy this year. We are living in interesting times, as the old Chinese saying goes. What do you think 2018 is going to bring?
Yeah, I think it's actually a Chinese curse, but I think the global economy is better. The global economy is fine, actually. A couple of years ago, I kept using the word okay, and people said, well, actually, we'll take okay. And now I use the word fine, and people say, oh, that doesn't sound very good. I think probably the mistake I'm finding is people are extrapolating the improvement we've seen the last couple of years, and the global economy unambiguously has improved. But I think that trend to improvement has been there for quite a while. I mean, people now talk about a European recovery. Well, European unemployment's been falling since 2013. And people talk about an Asian recovery. Well, the Asian economy's been recovering since 2015. And of course, the US has been doing well for quite a number of years. So I think growth is fine. I just don't think it's going to accelerate particularly, and that's probably going to start to disappoint expectations. And I think there's a few headwinds which are just going to start to take the gloss off things and start to focus us back on the fact that growth really is not strong enough to deal with the structural issues that it normally deals with when we recover out of some sort of kind of cyclical slowdown. It's probably not going to help us out of housing affordability problems in countries where we have them. It's probably not going to help us out of these political situations where electorates are signalling that their life is just not as great as they might thought it would be. And it's not going to help generate long-term growth. I think we're going to have to work harder on all of those things.
So what are these structural issues you talk about, housing affordability, etc., and I guess electorates being a bit unhappy about their lot? I mean, how can policymakers deal with these?
Well, look, we've been through this, in many ways, kind of golden age of globalisation in the last couple of decades, which has seen the largest improvement in global living standards we've ever seen. But within countries, often living standards have started to diverge. And if rates of growth are lower from a kind of structurally, and I think they are, I think, as I keep saying, growth is fine, I just don't think we're going back to the sort of rates of growth we had pre-crisis. With any sort of distribution around lower rates of growth, there's going to be more people whose lives actually are going backwards in GDP terms. And I think that's what you can see when you look at the way electorates have behaved the last couple of years around voting patterns. And I think, look, we all love a narrative. One of the things that makes us humans is we love a story, and social media feeds into that, right? And there were parts of electorates, I think, that often let the debate control them. And now they can tap away and have a view and find actually other people might have similar views, and now they're starting to affect the debate. And that's shifting the narrative and the political dynamic as well. So I think governments have to work out how they're going to deliver economic growth, because ultimately that's how we get higher living standards, but deliver it in a way where everybody feel like their boat's being lifted rather than other boats being lifted ahead of them.
That's a huge challenge, though, isn't it? I mean, to deliver growth in the modern world where everyone feels like their boat's being lifted. I mean, how do we do that?
Look, it is an enormous challenge, but the reality is policy can help us. I mean, if you look at distributional outcomes in Europe, they're radically different from other countries in the world. They're much more equal in India. They're much more equal in China. They're much more equal than the US. Now, Europe has struggled to deliver growth at the same time, so they haven't quite got everything right. But if you look at Finland, for instance, they are conducting a real-life experiment with a living wage. Up until this point, that's been quite a radical idea. When we start to think about the implications of technology for occupations and skills and labour markets, having that real-world experiment, I think, is going to be very useful.
Do you think, the living wage debate has been, it's been around in New Zealand probably for a couple of years. It's probably never really got a lot of traction, but it's certainly been around. Is this something we're going to hear more about in this part of the world, do you think?
Look, I'm not clued onto the local debate. I think to the extent that...
I should say universal basic income as a broader concept.
I do think it's going to be part of the debate. And I think in many ways, if we think about, I guess, what we call the epoch of China, right? The world economy with China in it and a full participant is radically different from the world pre-China, right? China now accounts for 25% of global manufacturing production. 25 years ago, it was 5%. Half of global steel production. It's the largest trading nation, more Chinese tourists than anyone else. You kind of go on, right? So China has clearly shifted the plates in a way that almost were unimaginable. I think technology is at least that big, but the impacts are probably broader, right? If it's changing the narrative around the political debate, and it's changing the way labour markets function, and it's changing the efficiency of the allocation of capital across a whole range of sectors. Amazon last night announced they're looking at entering the health sector in the US. Amazon's not entering the health sector to build hospitals. They're to improve the provision of that health service between the producer and the consumer, right? Like they've done in retail, like Uber's done with taxis and transport and other things. So I think we're going to be debating a whole lot of issues that we thought were resolved, and free trade is one of those.
Yeah, that's obviously on the agenda in this era. In terms of technology, I mean, what are the key changes you see in the next couple of years, I guess, primarily in terms of the way we work today?
Look, that's a broad question, actually. I think probably the way I'd answer it is, if you've noticed, the term artificial intelligence has kind of dropped off the radar, and I think because people finally admitted machines actually are pretty stupid, right? They can use a lot of data with enormous processing power, but they can only do what somebody else asks them to do. So we use the term machine learning. But even beyond machine learning, we need to have the imagination. So I don't know that it's about picking occupations, but it's about picking how you approach a task. And if you approach a task with a repetitive mindset, there's a realistic prospect that we'll work out how to do that with less human involvement, right? If you approach a task with an imaginative mindset, well, then that's not actually something a machine is capable of.
Okay, it's an interesting debate and discussion I'm sure we'll be continuing. What, in terms of New Zealand and Australia specifically, how do you think our economies are going to fare this year?
Look, I think growth is okay. I mean, New Zealand is much further advanced in the cycle than Australia, so Australia has more spare capacity. So New Zealand will probably see some more wobbles because it's getting towards that late cycle stage. But both economies have a similar feeling around the rate of growth, i.e. it's okay, but it hasn't really been sufficient to generate wage growth and raise incomes. And I think that will remain an ongoing challenge. And there are a range of reasons why that's occurred, and a lot of countries are struggling with that puzzle. I think technology has a significant role to play in that field as well.
And what will technology do in that area?
Well, look, I think if you even step back for a minute and think about the parts of any modern economy where you have technology-based new entrants, it's very difficult to think of a part of the economy which doesn't have that. In fact, health was one of the sectors I would have said doesn't have that. Now, Amazon's only just talked about entering health in the US, which hasn't made it here yet, but that also is the beginning of a different story. But, I mean, what technology's doing actually is often liberalising capacity which was already there and using it more efficiently. So Uber is a great example. 95% of cars in any advanced economy typically are parked at any one time. That capacity existed, was not being used properly. Uber's mobilised that. The freeing up of retail space because we increasingly shop online, that retail space enters the economy, something else has to happen to it. Even kind of smaller examples like higher education, those 300-seat lecture theatres you sit in, first year accounting or economics or law or something else, by week 3 these days they're empty because everyone watches their lectures online. So with competitive pressure on universities and commercial pressure, they're now needing to work out how they allocate that space into the market economy and use it more efficiently. So in fact, economically we have a twin puzzle across virtually every economy I look at. Wage growth, which is weaker than we thought, and in some economies much weaker than we thought, and business fixed investment just not recovering the way it normally would. And I think technology links those things in a way which says, actually, this is becoming quite pervasive for us.
Now, I mean, we're obviously undergoing massive change through technology at the moment, much of which we don't even probably understand or know about yet. How do you compare the changes going on now to what's happened in the past? Because I guess if you look at human history, there's always been change of some form going on, whether it be the Industrial Revolution or inventions of the wheel, the car, all those types of things over the years that have changed things a lot. I mean, how is today any different?
Yeah, look, ultimately productivity is the only route to sustainably high living standards. So all of those things you spoke about are why we live in a world today where Poverty levels are at the lowest levels we've ever measured, where we don't generally have outbreaks of disease anymore. We've, to a large degree, in large parts of the world, resolved those issues because the market economy has delivered productivity change, which has raised standards of living and allowed us to fund those things. Technology is another piece of that story. In that sense, I don't really accept arguments which say there will be no jobs. Right? As some things become commoditised, other things become more valuable. We don't necessarily know what those other things are yet, but we'll kind of work them out and they'll appear over time. That doesn't mean there's not enormous adjustment. So the 2/3 of agricultural workers during the agricultural revolution in the UK that lost their jobs, were their lives, was that enormously dislocated for their lives? Yes, it was. Did all of them find other jobs? Probably not. Certainly it took time for them to be absorbed into the economy. So I think we're seeing that now.
And inflation is one of the big issues as well, or lack of, in many parts of the world. What's your expectation for inflation over the next year or two around the globe?
Look, we will see some higher headline inflation numbers, largely because of oil prices and other commodity prices going up. In the last couple of years, we have seen a pickup in global headline inflation, and I think that is good. Higher inflation is not always good, but I think when it's close to zero, a bit of inflation is better, certainly. And that will persist over the next year or so, I think. I suspect also we'll see a pickup in core inflation. I am less confident around that because that has been the hardest part of the inflation cycle to pick. But I suspect we'll also see a pickup in core inflation. I just think it will be quite modest, and it will be driven by a pretty modest pickup in wages.
And what sort of impact do you expect on interest rates around the world?
Interests, I don't know that there's a common theme, but certainly if you look at interest rates and monetary policy globally, we've passed the easiest point in the cycle. And it's not just the Fed that's been hiking, but the European Central Bank, while they're still buying bonds to support the yield curve in Europe, are buying less. And I think over the course of the next 12 months, they'll send a signal about what the end of that process looks like. The Bank of Korea has hiked policy for the first time this cycle. We've seen that in Malaysia, we've seen that in the UK, we've seen it in Canada. I think we'll probably see it in Australia next year. Sometime through the middle part of this year. So as a group, if you look at central banks, they're starting to take the punch bowl away.
Well, yeah, it's going to be another interesting year, Richard. Appreciate your time. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
That's Richard Yetsenga, the Chief Economist at the ANZ Group, and I'm Gareth Vaughan at interest.co.nz.